The snowstorm howled through the night, a force of nature that no living being should have been caught in. But then, a faint scratching at the door, a weak whimper. Emma hesitated, her breath fogging up the cold glass as she peeked outside. There, barely visible in the blizzard, stood a golden retriever, its fur matted with ice, its body trembling. One paw lifted, injured. But why was it here, all alone in the middle of a storm? And more importantly, who was chasing it? We'd love to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment and be part of this journey with us. May this story bring warmth to your heart. Now, let's begin. The wind howled outside, rattling the wooden walls of the farmhouse, as if trying to claw its way inside. 9-year-old Emma Carter sat cross-legged on the living room floor, wrapped in her father's old military blanket. It still carried the faint scent of him, leather, pine, and a hint of gun oil, despite the fact that he had been gone for nearly 7 months. Emma was small for her age, with wispy blonde hair that never quite stayed in place, and deep brown eyes that held a wisdom beyond her years. Her father, Daniel Carter, had always told her that she was braver than she thought. But tonight, in the heart of a Montana blizzard, she wasn't so sure. Across the room, her grandmother, Margaret Carter, sat in her rocking chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. At 72, Margaret was a woman of quiet strength, with silver-streaked auburn hair always pulled back in a tight bun. A lifetime of hardship had etched fine lines into her face, but her eyes remained sharp, filled with the resilience of someone who had weathered many storms, both literal and personal. Her husband had been a soldier before Daniel, and she had learned long ago how to hold a family together in times of war and separation. The old farmhouse had been in their family for 3 generations. Built by Emma's great-grandfather, it had withstood many winters, its thick wooden beams groaning under the weight of snow piled high on the roof. But tonight, the storm was relentless. Roads were buried under 5-foot drifts, the power had gone out 3 hours ago, and the only warmth came from the iron pot-belly stove in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the hardwood floor. Emma shivered and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. She should have been asleep, but the howling wind outside made her uneasy. It reminded her too much of last year's tornado, the one that had struck while her father was home on leave. She had clung to him in the root cellar, listening to the wind rip apart the world above them. He had held her close, whispering stories to keep her calm, but he wasn't here now. She reached beneath the blanket and pulled out her notebook, its pages filled with letters to her father. Letters he wouldn't read until he came home. She flipped to the last entry and began writing by the dim glow of the firelight. Dear Dad, the blizzard came just like Mr. Henderson predicted. His bad knee never lies, you know. Grandma is worried about the generator, but I told her you showed me how to fix it. I remember everything you taught me. I miss you. Her pencil stilled as a new sound cut through the wind, a scratching at the door. Emma's heart jumped. At first, she thought it was just debris thrown against the house by the violent gusts, but then she heard it again. Deliberate, desperate. A whimper followed. She froze, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Their farmhouse was nearly a mile from the nearest neighbor, and in weather like this, no one should be outside. Grandma, she called softly, but Margaret's gentle snoring continued undisturbed from the adjacent bedroom. The scratching intensified, followed by a louder, more pleading whine. Emma swallowed hard. Something was out there, something alive, something suffering. Mustering her courage, she stood and crept toward the front door. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Fear makes you freeze, but bravery is acting even when you're scared. Standing on tiptoe, she wiped a small circle clear on the frost-covered window beside the door. At first, she saw only the swirling white chaos of the storm. But then, movement. A large golden retriever, its thick golden fur matted with ice and snow, stood shivering on the porch. It was a powerful-looking dog, well-built, but its strength was failing. One of its front paws was lifted, injured, and blood had frozen in dark patches along its side. Emma gasped. The dog lifted its head, its deep amber eyes locking onto hers, filled with an intelligence and desperation that sent shivers down her spine. It lifted its uninjured paw and scratched weakly at the door again, as if asking for entry. Emma had grown up around animals, barn cats, working dogs, the occasional lost deer that wandered too close to the property. but she had never seen an animal seek human help so deliberately. A voice in her head whispered Grandma's warnings. Never open the door to strangers, human or animal. Injured creatures can be dangerous. But the dog didn't look dangerous. It looked like it was begging. A choice hung in the air, fragile as ice. Emma unlatched the heavy wooden door and cracked it open. The wind hit her like a slap, icy and merciless. The golden retriever didn't move. It stood motionless, trembling uncontrollably. Its gaze locked onto Emma's face. "It's okay," she whispered, extending her hand the way her father had taught her. Palm down, slow movements. "I won't hurt you." To her amazement, the dog didn't growl, didn't flinch. It simply inched forward on 3 legs, sniffed her hand, then pressed its frozen muzzle against her fingers. A silent plea. "Come inside," she urged, stepping back. "Please, before you freeze." The dog hesitated at the threshold, its body swaying slightly, as if gathering what little strength it had left. Then, with a labored movement, it limped inside. Emma quickly shut the door behind it, sealing out the bitter cold. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The dog stood in the dim glow of the stove light, its body still trembling, its breathing ragged. Up close she could see that it was thin, ribs faintly visible beneath its wet fur. But it wasn't a stray. Around its neck was a tattered harness, frayed and torn, as if it had been through something terrible. This wasn't just some lost farm dog. It had belonged to someone. And that someone, Emma realized, might be looking for it. Or worse, it might be running from them. Emma's heart pounded as she crouched beside the dog, reaching for an old towel from the linen closet. "I'm going to dry you off," she murmured. "Then we'll see what's wrong, okay?" The dog stood perfectly still as she gently patted its fur, ice and snow melting away under her touch. When she reached its side, it flinched. Emma's stomach tightened. Deep lacerations ran along its ribs, partially hidden beneath its thick coat. Some of them had glass embedded in them. "What happened to you?" she whispered. Then, as she reached for the harness, her fingers brushed against a small metal tag, half buried in matted fur. She carefully pushed the hair aside and read the engraved text. "Maverick, military working dog, U.S. Army." Emma's breath hitched. A military dog? Here? In the middle of a Montana blizzard? The dog, Maverick, lifted his head and looked directly into her eyes. And for the first time that night, Emma felt something stronger than fear. Fate. Her father had always said there were no coincidences in life, only moments of purpose waiting to be understood. And somehow, some way, this dog had found its way to her door. The blizzard outside had quieted, leaving behind a world buried under thick snow. The howling wind had given way to an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden farmhouse. Inside, Emma sat on the worn-out rug near the fireplace, watching Maximus with curiosity and concern. The golden retriever lay curled up, his thick golden fur still damp in places, his injured legs stretched out slightly. His eyes, dark and intelligent, flickered toward Emma every now and then as if trying to gauge whether he was truly safe. The name on his collar still echoed in Emma's mind. Maximus, Canine Military Rescue. It didn't make sense. Why would a trained military rescue dog be out here, alone, injured, in the middle of a snowstorm? Emma's fingers brushed over the leather of the collar again, feeling the raised ridges where the letters had been etched in. There was something else about it, something she hadn't noticed before. As she turned it carefully in her hands, a small metal clasp on the inside caught the light. It looked like a hidden compartment. "Grandma, look," she said, shifting toward Margaret, who was sitting nearby in her rocking chair, knitting half forgotten in her lap. Margaret Carter, despite her age, still carried herself with quiet strength. Her hair, once a rich brown, was now silver, tied in a loose bun at the nape of her neck. Her face bore the fine lines of years spent braving Montana's harsh winters, but her blue eyes were sharp, thoughtful. She had been skeptical at first about letting the dog inside, but now, as she looked at Maximus, calm, intelligent, and strangely obedient, she was beginning to wonder if his arrival was more than mere coincidence. She took the collar from Emma's hands, examining the hidden clasp. With careful fingers, she pressed against it. The leather gave a faint snap, and a small metallic object fell into her palm. It was a USB drive. Emma's eyes widened. Why would a dog have something like this? Margaret frowned, weighing the device in her hand. That's what we need to find out. Before they could say anything else, Maximus lifted his head, ears twitching. His body tensed, his gaze snapping toward the door. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Emma's heart jumped. "What is it, boy?" Margaret reached for the shotgun leaning against the fireplace. She had lived on this land long enough to trust the instincts of animals, especially dogs. If Maximus was sensing something, it wasn't just the wind. A shadow flickered past the window. Emma sucked in a breath. Someone was out there. Margaret rose to her feet with quiet urgency, motioning for Emma to stay put. She moved to the door, peeking through the frosted glass. Outside, the snow-covered yard stretched toward the barn and the tree line beyond. The sky was still heavy with storm clouds, and the world was bathed in a dull gray light. But there, just beyond the fence, a dark figure stood, barely visible against the snow. Emma pressed closer, her breath fogging up the glass. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching the house. Margaret's grip on the shotgun tightened. "Stay inside," she murmured to Emma before unlocking the door and stepping onto the porch. The cold bit at her skin instantly, but she ignored it. "Who's out there?" she called. No answer. Maximus, now standing just behind her, let out another low growl. His tail was stiff, his body tense. Margaret took another step forward. "I said—" The figure turned sharply and disappeared into the trees. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before stepping back inside and bolting the door. "We're not alone out here," she muttered, placing the shotgun back within reach. Emma shivered, but not from the cold. "What do we do?" Margaret glanced at the USB drive in her palm, then at Maximus. "First, we figure out what's on this." Later that evening, as the farmhouse settled into a tense silence, Emma sat at the kitchen table, watching as Margaret plugged the USB into her old laptop. The screen flickered, the aging machine whirring as it struggled to process the new data. A single file appeared on the screen. Margaret clicked on it. A series of encrypted documents filled the screen, along with a video file labeled with a date. 2 weeks ago. Emma swallowed hard. "Play it." Margaret hesitated for only a second before clicking on the file. The screen went black, then flickered to life. A man appeared, dressed in a military uniform, his face shadowed but his voice clear. "If you're seeing this," he said, "then something's gone wrong." Emma and Margaret exchanged a look. Maximus, lying near their feet, let out a quiet whimper, as if he too knew that their quiet life in Montana had just changed forever. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick, overcast sky, casting a pale glow over the snow-covered landscape. The storm had subsided, but the aftermath was evident. Thick layers of snow coated every surface, and sharp icicles hung from the edges of the wooden porch like frozen daggers. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of tree branches burdened with heavy snow. Emma rubbed her hands together, breathing warmth into her fingers as she peered through the frost-rimmed window. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, and then her heart lurched. Footprints. A clear trail of deep, fresh footprints carved into the snow, leading from the forest's edge toward the house. She blinked, hoping she was imagining it, but the prints were unmistakable. Someone had been here. Recently. Her breath hitched as she stepped back, turning to Maximus, who was already alert. The large golden retriever stood near the fireplace, ears pricked forward, golden fur bristling slightly. His intelligent brown eyes flicked toward the door, as if sensing the same presence she had. The previous night, he had been exhausted, injured, barely able to move. But now, despite the lingering weakness in his hind leg, he looked ready to defend. "Grandma," Emma called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret had been busy in the kitchen, heating water over the old iron stove. She was a woman accustomed to the hardships of rural life, with silver-streaked auburn hair tied in a loose bun, sharp green eyes, and a frame that, despite her age, still held strength. Decades of solitude had made her wary of strangers. She had lived through times when isolation was the safest way to survive, especially after losing her husband to war and her son to duty. She set the kettle down, noticing Emma's pale expression. "What is it, child?" Emma swallowed hard. "Someone was outside." Margaret frowned, wiping her hands on her apron as she made her way toward the window. Her sharp eyes immediately spotted the footprints. A flicker of unease passed over her face. "Stay inside," she instructed firmly before pulling her coat off the rack. Emma didn't argue, but her eyes darted nervously toward Maximus. The dog was tense, muscles coiled as if anticipating trouble. His gaze followed Margaret as she stepped onto the porch. The cold hit Margaret instantly, but she barely noticed. She kneeled beside the footprints, examining them closely. Large, heavy, at least 2 different pairs of boots. The snow was packed deep, meaning they had been standing there for a while, watching. Then she heard it, the crunch of footsteps in the distance. She straightened, her pulse quickening. Emerging from the tree line, 2 men approached. Both were clad in thick winter coats, hoods pulled low over their faces. The taller of the 2 had broad shoulders and a strong gait, moving like someone used to command. The other, leaner but no less imposing, carried a shotgun slung across his back. Their movements were calculated, their eyes scanning every detail of the house and its surroundings. Margaret instinctively placed her hand on the doorknob, positioning herself between them and the house. They weren't from around here, and they weren't just passing by. As the men neared, the taller one raised a hand in greeting, his voice carrying over the icy air. "Morning, ma'am. Sorry to bother you, but we're looking for something." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She studied them, noting the tension in their postures. "And what would that be?" she asked coolly. The leaner man took a step forward, his piercing gray eyes narrowing. "A dog." Margaret's heart pounded, but her face remained impassive. "A dog?" "A large golden retriever," the taller one clarified. "Might be hurt. We lost him last night during the storm." Margaret feigned confusion. "A dog, you say?" "Haven't seen one." The leaner man exhaled sharply, his breath forming a white cloud in the cold air. His gaze flicked toward the barn, then toward the house. "Would you mind if we take a look around?" Margaret tightened her grip on the door frame. "I do mind," she said, steel edging her voice. "This is private property." The men exchanged a glance. The taller one chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "We don't mean any trouble, ma'am. But you see, that dog isn't just any dog. He belongs to us, and we'd very much like to have him back." Inside, Emma had been listening intently, pressing herself against the wall. Her hands trembled as she turned to Maximus. The dog's ears flattened slightly, his body low to the ground, as if understanding the danger. Margaret straightened, fixing the men with a cold stare. "If you lost him, I suggest you keep looking elsewhere." The leaner man took another step forward, his fingers brushing against his coat, where Emma spotted a holster. The realization sent a chill through her veins. They were armed. Then Maximus growled. It was low, guttural, a sound that made the hairs on Emma's arms stand on end. The taller man's eyes snapped toward the house. "You sure about that, ma'am?" he asked, voice tight. Margaret didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." A long pause stretched between them. Then, the leaner man exhaled through his nose and nodded once. "All right," he said, voice clipped. "If you happen to see a dog, let us know." Without another word, they turned and walked back toward the trees. But they didn't leave the way they came. They circled behind the house. Margaret didn't move until they were out of sight. Then, swiftly, she stepped back inside and locked the door. Margaret's face was set in hard lines. "Get Maximus into the cellar." Emma's stomach clenched, but she nodded. She grabbed Maximus's collar and led him toward the small trap door near the pantry. The dog followed obediently, though his ears were still pinned back, his body tense. As the wooden door creaked open, a rush of cold air met them. The cellar was old, built by her great-grandfather, its stone walls lined with shelves of preserved goods. The floor was hard-packed earth, and a small cot sat in the corner. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe. Emma hesitated before looking up at her grandmother. "They'll come back, won't they?" Margaret's expression darkened. "Yes," she said, "and next time, they won't be asking." 4-0. Margaret waited until she was sure the men had disappeared beyond the tree line before she moved. Her heart was still pounding, but she didn't let it show. Years of living in isolation had taught her to keep a calm head in the face of danger. She locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and then turned to Emma, who stood frozen near the cellar door, with Maximus pressed against her legs. The dog's ears were still pinned back, his muscles tense with instinctive wariness. Margaret exhaled sharply, running a hand over her forehead. "We don't have much time. They'll be back. she muttered under her breath, glancing toward the pantry shelf where she had hidden the USB drive earlier. Emma bit her lip. "Grandma, what do they want with Maximus?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She moved quickly, grabbing the USB and heading toward the small wooden desk tucked into the corner of the living room. The computer sitting on top of it was old, a relic from the early 2000s, but it still worked well enough. As she plugged in the USB, Maximus let out a low whine, sitting down near the desk, his sharp eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The screen flickered to life, and a small folder appeared. Margaret hesitated before clicking it open. What she saw made her stomach tighten. Inside, there were dozens of files, each labeled with military codes and acronyms she didn't fully understand. But some were more telling. Video recordings, scanned documents, and satellite images. Her breath caught in her throat as she clicked on a report titled Operation Iron Fang, Declassified. Emma leaned over her shoulder, eyes wide. "What is it?" Margaret didn't reply, scrolling through the first few pages. The document was a military report detailing an undercover operation overseas, aimed at dismantling a dangerous arms smuggling ring. The names were redacted, but the details were clear. A group of mercenaries had been selling stolen military-grade weapons to a powerful international crime syndicate. The report included coordinates of secret exchange locations, photographs of the suspects, and surveillance footage of meetings taking place in remote locations. Then Margaret's eyes fell on something that made her blood run cold, a picture of Maximus. The image showed the same golden-coated dog sitting obediently beside a man in military fatigues. The caption beneath it read, "A K-9 unit, Maximus, military rescue and reconnaissance, status, active, last known deployment, classified." Emma's hand flew to her mouth. "Grandma, Maximus is a military dog?" Margaret clicked on another file, a grainy video. The footage was shaky, as if taken from a body camera. In it, a group of soldiers moved through a dense forest under cover of night. A mission was underway. Then, the camera panned down to Maximus, fully geared, wearing a harness with a small camera attached to it. He was leading the team, sniffing out something ahead. Then came the gunfire, shouts. The video cut off abruptly. Margaret's stomach twisted. This wasn't just any dog. Maximus had been part of something big, something that went wrong, and somehow he had escaped with this USB. Emma clutched Maximus's fur, staring at the screen. If those men were looking for Maximus, it's not because they care about him, is it? Margaret closed the laptop. "No," she said grimly. "They want what he has." There was a long silence. The crackling of the fireplace was the only sound in the room. Then Emma whispered, "Are they going to come back for us?" Margaret clenched her jaw. "Yes, and next time they won't just be asking about a lost dog." She moved quickly, shutting down the computer and pulling the USB from its port. "We need to hide this," she muttered, her mind racing. She couldn't just destroy it. This was evidence, but keeping it here was dangerous. Her eyes flicked toward the kitchen. "Emma, go grab my sewing kit." Emma hesitated but obeyed, disappearing into the next room. Margaret knelt by Maximus, looking at him with newfound understanding. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she murmured. Maximus met her gaze, his deep brown eyes filled with something eerily human. Loyalty, intelligence, and a lingering shadow of past battles. He let out a quiet huff, nudging her hand. Emma returned with the sewing kit, and Margaret took out an old fabric pouch, one she had used for keeping valuables hidden when her husband was alive. She carefully slipped the USB inside, stitching the opening shut with precise, steady hands. When she was done, she walked over to the pantry and reached up to the highest shelf, tucking the pouch into a jar of rice. Emma watched, frowning. "You really think they'll come back?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She grabbed a shotgun from behind the coat rack and checked the ammunition. "I think they never left." A chill ran down Emma's spine. Outside, the wind howled, sweeping up fine snowflakes and swirling them through the air. And somewhere beyond the tree line, eyes were still watching. Margaret stood in the dim light of the cabin, her fingers gripping the strap of the old duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The decision had been made. They had to leave. There was no time for second-guessing, no room for hesitation. The men who had come looking for Maximus weren't finished. They would return, and when they did, they wouldn't be as polite. Emma sat on the worn-out couch, holding Maximus close. The golden retriever had been unusually quiet, his eyes sharp and alert, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. He knew. He understood the danger just as well as they did. Margaret knelt in front of her granddaughter, placing a hand on her knee. "Sweetheart, we're going to Jack's. Do you remember Jack Thompson?" Emma nodded. "The man from the pictures? Grandpa's friend?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed, offering a small, reassuring smile. "He was in the army with your grandpa. He'll help us." Jack Thompson had retired years ago, settling in Bozeman, Montana, far from the kind of trouble Margaret now found herself tangled in. But he was the only person she trusted. If anyone could protect them and figure out what was on that USB, it was Jack. "We'll leave as soon as the sun sets," Margaret said, rising to her feet. "Pack what you need, but nothing heavy. We have to move quickly." Emma hesitated. "Are we coming back?" Margaret's heart clenched. She didn't have an answer. Instead, she reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "Let's just focus on getting somewhere safe, okay?" Emma nodded, though her lips pressed into a thin line. She was scared. Margaret was too. She turned to the old wooden cabinet near the fireplace and pulled out a small metal lockbox. Inside was an old revolver, a relic from her husband's days as a sheriff's deputy. She checked the cylinder. 6 bullets. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The road to Bozeman. By the time they pulled onto the road, the sky was a deep shade of blue, the last remnants of daylight fading behind the mountains. The truck's tires crunched against the icy road as Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the narrow path ahead. The wind had died down, but the air was still thick with the weight of the coming storm. Emma sat in the passenger seat, Maximus lying across her lap. His breathing was steady, but his muscles remained tense. He had barely taken his eyes off the road since they left the cabin. Margaret checked the rearview mirror. Empty. No headlights. No movement. Maybe, just maybe, they had gotten lucky. They drove in silence for the first 30 minutes, the only sound the soft hum of the engine and the occasional whimper from Maximus. But then, a flash of light. Margaret's hands tightened around the steering wheel. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing larger with each passing second. Her stomach twisted. Emma noticed it too. "Grandma?" Margaret forced her voice to remain steady. "It's fine, sweetheart. Just another car." But it wasn't. The headlights stayed too steady, too precise, matching their speed as if tracking them. Then, as they reached a bend in the road, the vehicle accelerated. Margaret's breath hitched. It was a black SUV, the same kind the men had driven. Her grip tightened. They weren't alone anymore. The chase had begun. Margaret gritted her teeth as she struggled to keep the truck steady on the icy road. The SUV behind them closed the distance, its headlights glaring through the rear window like predatory eyes. Emma clutched Maximus tightly, her breath coming in ragged gasps as fear clawed at her chest. The golden retriever, though injured, remained alert, his ears perked, his body tense. He sensed the danger just as much as they did. The black SUV swerved aggressively, trying to force them off the road. Margaret's hands tightened around the wheel, her knuckles turning white. "Hold on!" she shouted, jerking the truck to the side just in time to avoid a direct hit. The tires skidded, the vehicle fishtailing dangerously before she regained control. Emma screamed as the SUV rammed them again, harder this time. The impact sent their truck sliding onto the shoulder, where the snow was deeper and the road less stable. The back of the truck slammed into a tree, jarring them all violently. Margaret's head smacked against the steering wheel, but she remained conscious. "We have to get out!" she gasped, fumbling with the door handle. "They won't stop until they get what they want." Emma was trembling, her fingers digging into Maximus's fur. "Grandma, I'm scared." "I know, sweetheart," Margaret whispered. "But we have to move, now." Before they could make it out, the doors of the SUV flew open, and 2 men stepped out. One of them was tall, broad-shouldered, and wrapped in a heavy black coat. His face was partially obscured by a thick beard, but his sharp eyes gleamed with cold calculation. His partner was leaner, wiry, with sunken cheeks and a scar running from his left eyebrow to his chin. They moved like men accustomed to violence, their postures rigid with intent. The bearded man pulled a gun from his coat and pointed it at the truck. "Come on out," he ordered, his voice gruff and commanding. "We're not here to hurt you. Margaret's jaw clenched. Liar. Emma whimpered, clutching Maximus even tighter. The dog let out a low, warning growl, his fur bristling. The scarred man took a step closer, his lips twisting into a smirk. "We just want the dog," he said. "No need for things to get messy." Margaret's heart pounded. They couldn't hand over Maximus. She had seen what was on that USB. These men were criminals, and if they got their hands on it, they would erase every shred of evidence linking them to their crimes. She had to stall. "Why?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the fear racing through her. "Why is this dog so important to you?" The bearded man scoffed. "You don't need to worry about that, lady. Just step aside." Emma clutched Maximus desperately, but the dog had other ideas. With a sudden burst of energy, Maximus lunged forward. The movement was so fast, so unexpected, that neither of the men had time to react. The golden retriever, despite his wounds, was a trained military dog, a protector, a warrior. He crashed into the scarred man, knocking him to the ground. A struggle erupted. The man thrashed, trying to push Maximus off, but the dog was relentless, his teeth snapping dangerously close to the man's throat. "Shoot the damn dog!" the bearded man barked. Emma screamed, "No!" The gun was raised, the trigger pulled. A blaring siren shattered the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the darkness. Tires screeched against the icy pavement as several police cars skidded to a halt. "Drop your weapon!" a commanding voice rang out. The bearded man hesitated for only a second before making the mistake of running. Officers flooded the scene, their guns drawn, their orders sharp. The scarred man managed to shove Maximus away and tried to scramble to his feet, but the golden retriever was still fighting. Despite his injuries, he leapt at the man again, clamping his jaws onto his arm just as an officer tackled them both to the ground. Margaret exhaled shakily as officers restrained both men. Relief flooded her system, but it was short-lived. Maximus was bleeding heavily. Emma dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she stroked his golden fur. His breathing was labored, his body trembling. "Maximus," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Please don't leave me." Margaret placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder, her own throat tight with emotion. One of the officers, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a kind but weary face, knelt beside them. His badge read, Sergeant William Hayes. "You folks all right?" he asked, concern in his eyes. Margaret nodded faintly. "The dog, he saved us." Hayes looked at Maximus, then at the restrained criminals. His gaze hardened. "We've been tracking these guys for weeks," he said. "The information we received from an anonymous source led us to this area," Margaret realized with a jolt. The USB. Someone in law enforcement must have intercepted the data. "You need to get your dog to a vet," Hayes said gently. "I'll have my team escort you." Emma sniffled, pressing her forehead against Maximus's. "We'll save you, Maximus," she whispered, "just like you saved us." Margaret nodded, determination setting in. They weren't losing him. Not now. Not after everything. But time was running out. Maximus lay on the examination table, his golden fur still matted with dried blood, his breathing shallow but steady. The veterinarian, Dr. Olivia Bennett, moved swiftly yet gently, her hands experienced and sure. She was a woman in her late 40s, tall and slender, with streaks of silver in her auburn hair, tied back in a practical bun. Years of working with injured animals had given her an air of quiet strength, but there was a softness in her eyes whenever she looked at a wounded creature. Emma sat nearby, barely blinking as she watched Dr. Bennett work. Her small hands were clenched together, knuckles white. Margaret sat beside her, one hand resting on her granddaughter's shoulder, offering silent comfort. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, mixing with the faint, lingering, coppery smell of blood. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Bennett finally looked up. "He's stable for now. The bullet only grazed his side, but he lost a lot of blood. He'll need rest, but he's a fighter." She gave Emma a reassuring smile. "He's lucky to have you." Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached for Maximus's paw. He stirred slightly at her touch, his tail giving the faintest wag. The relief was short-lived when the door to the clinic creaked open. A tall man in a crisp military uniform stepped inside. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, but there was something deeply familiar in his dark eyes. He removed his hat, revealing short, graying hair, and a strong, angular face marked by years of service. Lieutenant Carlos Rivera. Margaret's breath hitched at the sight of him. He looked like a man who had seen too much, burdened with secrets he could never fully share. His uniform was pressed to perfection, yet the lines on his face betrayed exhaustion. This was a man who had lived through battles, not just on the field, but within himself. Emma clutched Maximus's paw tighter as Carlos approached, his gaze locked onto the wounded dog, his lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. "I trained him," Carlos finally said, his voice thick with emotion. He kneeled beside the table, reaching out hesitantly before placing a firm but gentle hand on Maximus's head. The dog's ears twitched, and though weak, his dark eyes flickered with recognition. Emma's brows furrowed. "You know Maximus?" Carlos nodded. "More than that. I was his handler." He exhaled heavily, as if preparing himself for something difficult. Maximus wasn't just any military dog. He was part of a classified mission overseas. We were deployed together. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "But I thought he was gone." Margaret leaned forward. "Gone?" Carlos's gaze darkened. "We were ambushed during a critical operation, a mission that was never supposed to exist." He glanced at Emma, then at Maximus, before continuing. Maximus had been trained for search and rescue under extreme conditions. During the raid, we got separated. The enemy was closing in, and we were ordered to evacuate. He looked at Maximus, guilt flickering in his expression. But he didn't leave. He must have followed the scent trail of the mission files we were supposed to recover, and somehow, he made it back. Emma's eyes widened. He carried the evidence. Carlos gave a slow nod. And that evidence is what led to the arrest of those men. He turned back to Maximus, his voice softer now. "You did good, buddy." A silence settled over the room, thick with the weight of revelation. Then, Carlos turned to Margaret, his expression solemn. "There's something else." Margaret stiffened. "What?" Carlos exhaled deeply. "Before Maximus was assigned to me, he was deployed on multiple missions. One of those missions involved saving the life of a soldier. That soldier was Sergeant Daniel Carter." Margaret's breath hitched. "Daniel?" Carlos nodded. "Your son." Emma's hands flew to her mouth. "Wait, you mean Maximus was with my dad?" Carlos's expression softened. "Yes. Your father and Maximus served together. Maximus saved his life once, and now, somehow, he found his way back to your family." He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Of all the places he could have ended up, he came here. That's not coincidence, Emma." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. "That's fate." For a long moment, no one spoke. Emma turned back to Maximus, fresh tears streaming down her face. But this time, they weren't just tears of sadness, they were of gratitude. Maximus had come back to them, to her family. Carlos straightened, his expression growing more official again. "Maximus is a hero, and the military wants to honor him. He's being officially retired from service." Emma blinked. "You mean he won't have to go back?" Carlos shook his head. "No more missions, no more battles. He's done his duty." He studied the little girl for a long moment before asking the question that would change everything. "Emma," he said gently, "would you like Maximus to stay with you?" Emma's eyes widened, her breath hitching. "You mean we can keep him?" Carlos smiled for the first time since stepping into the room. "Yes, if you want him." There was no hesitation. Emma threw her arms around Maximus's neck, burying her face into his fur. "Yes! 1,000 times yes!" Margaret wiped a tear from her eye, watching her granddaughter embrace the dog that had, in many ways, saved them all. Carlos nodded, satisfied. Then Maximus is home. Maximus had finally found where he truly belonged. Maximus's journey was not just one of survival, but of destiny. He was more than a soldier, more than a rescuer. He was a symbol of loyalty, courage, and the unseen threads that tie us together. Through storms, danger, and the unknown, he found his way back to the very family he was meant to protect. This story reminds us that true bonds cannot be broken, and that sometimes fate works in ways we may not understand. Whether human or animal, love finds a way to reunite those who are meant to be together. And just like Maximus, we all have a place where we truly belong. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it touched your heart, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and hope. May God bless you and guide you always. The crows circled above, their black wings casting eerie shadows over the snow. In the middle of the frozen forest, a tiny golden retriever puppy lay trembling, surrounded by sharp beaks and piercing eyes. It had no strength left to run, no voice left to cry for help. But just as the first crow lunged, fate intervened. An old man appeared, his eyes locking onto the helpless pup. What happened next would change not only the puppy's life, but his own as well. The winter morning was bleak, the sky a dull gray as the wind whispered through the bare branches of the trees. Snow had fallen overnight, covering the ground in a thick, unbroken layer of white. Everything was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustling of brittle leaves and the distant creak of ice-laden limbs swaying in the wind. Then, a sound broke through the stillness. A faint, pitiful whimper. It was weak, almost lost beneath the cold breath of winter, but it was there, trembling with desperation. Near the base of a gnarled oak tree, half buried in snow, lay a tiny golden retriever puppy. His fur, once a soft golden cream, was now damp and clumped with ice and dirt. He couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old, too small, too fragile to be out in the cold alone. His large brown eyes, dark as chestnuts, darted frantically, filled with fear and confusion. His frail legs twitched as if he wanted to move, but he was too weak. The snow around him was disturbed by tiny paw prints, as if he had struggled to find warmth, but had finally collapsed, exhausted. Above him, perched on twisted branches, sat a murder of crows, their sleek black feathers stark against the pale landscape. Their beady eyes were fixed on the helpless creature below, their talons gripping the bark as they shifted restlessly, waiting. One let out a sharp caw, and the others followed, their calls echoing through the frozen air. A single crow swooped lower, its wings flaring as it landed a few feet away, tilting its head curiously at the trembling pup. A little farther down the trail, Walter, an elderly man with a slow but steady gait, walked along the narrow forest path. He was tall but slightly hunched with age, his frame wrapped in a thick wool coat that had seen better days. His silver-gray beard was rough and unkempt, a contrast to the sharp blue eyes that still held a quiet alertness. Deep lines marked his weathered face, the kind that spoke of a man who had lived long enough to understand both joy and sorrow. Walter had spent most of his later years alone in a small cabin on the outskirts of town. He was once a skilled carpenter, a man with strong hands and steady patience, but life had carved its own path, leaving him in solitude. His wife had passed long ago, and his only son, the light of his world, was taken from him too soon. After that, Walter had withdrawn, preferring the quiet company of nature to the noise of people. That morning, he had set out on his usual walk, his boots crunching through the fresh snow. It was a habit more than anything, a way to clear his thoughts and let the silence settle around him. But as he neared the clearing, the faint cries reached his ears, making him stop. He frowned. That wasn't the sound of a wild animal. It was something smaller, something helpless. Turning off the path, Walter moved toward the sound, his steps deliberate yet cautious. As he approached, the sight came into view. The small, trembling puppy surrounded by crows. His brow furrowed as he took in the scene. The little thing was barely moving, its breath shallow, its tiny body shivering violently. The birds, sensing its weakness, were watching, waiting. Walter exhaled slowly, feeling a familiar pang in his chest. He wasn't the kind of man to interfere with nature's course. He had seen plenty of things in the wild that he had learned to turn away from, knowing some battles weren't his to fight. But something about the way the puppy looked at him, its eyes round and pleading, made his resolve falter. It wasn't just lost. It was abandoned. He stepped forward, waving a hand at the crows. They flapped their wings in irritation, letting out sharp cries before retreating to the branches above, still watching. Walter knelt in the snow, studying the little creature curled up before him. The pup let out a soft whimper, but didn't move away. "Where did you come from, little one?" he murmured, his voice rough from years of quiet. Up close, he could see the signs of neglect, the matted fur, the way its ribs were faintly visible beneath the fluff, and the thin scar around its neck where a collar must have once been. Someone had left it here, and, from the looks of it, not by accident. Walter sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He had told himself long ago that he was done taking in strays, done opening his home to things he wasn't sure he could care for. But as he reached down, slipping his hands beneath the small, freezing body, he already knew he wouldn't walk away. The puppy flinched at first, a small, weak whine escaping its throat, but it didn't fight him. It was too exhausted to resist. Walter could feel the frailness beneath his touch, the way the tiny body barely weighed anything at all. He pulled the pup close to his chest, shielding it from the wind. "You're not going to make it out here, that's for sure," he muttered, adjusting his grip. The crows let out another chorus of calls from above, as if protesting the interruption of their grim vigil. But Walter ignored them as he turned back toward his cabin. The snow had started falling again, the wind picking up as the storm crept closer. Holding the tiny, trembling pup against him, he took a steady step forward, leaving behind the empty clearing and the waiting eyes of the crows. Walter pushed open the heavy wooden door of his cabin, the warmth of the crackling fireplace immediately wrapping around him like an old embrace. The wind howled outside as the storm settled in, thick flakes of snow swirling against the frosted window panes. He stepped inside carefully, still cradling the small bundle of fur in his arms, feeling the rapid but weak heartbeat of the puppy against his chest. His home was simple, built with sturdy hands decades ago, a place meant for a family that never came. The furniture was worn but well kept, the bookshelves lined with dust-coated novels, relics of a past where he had once cared about stories other than his own. Now, the only sound that ever filled the space was the occasional creak of old wood and the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the mantel. He set the pup down on a thickly woven rug near the fire, kneeling beside it. The little thing curled into itself immediately, its small body still shivering despite the heat radiating from the flames. Walter took off his heavy coat, draping it over the trembling creature, hoping the added warmth would help. He reached for a metal pot that sat on a cast-iron stove in the corner, pouring some leftover broth into a small bowl. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and any dog in its right mind would lap it up eagerly. He placed the bowl near the puppy's nose, expecting it to perk up at the scent of food. But Buddy, because that was the name that had formed in Walter's mind, as if the pup had always been meant to be called that, didn't move. Walter frowned, watching closely. The pup's nose twitched, nostrils flaring slightly, but it made no attempt to eat. That wasn't right. A starving animal should be desperate for food, should have scrambled toward the bowl the second it was placed down. But Buddy remained frozen, small paws tucked under his frail body, his round eyes darting cautiously around the room, ears pinned low against his head. Walter exhaled slowly, running a hand through his graying hair. This wasn't just exhaustion, it was fear. Something had scared this dog beyond reason, had broken the natural instincts it should have had to survive. Walter wasn't a man of many words, but he knew animals better than he knew people, had spent years observing them in the wild, understanding their behaviors. This was learned fear, not just the hesitation of a lost pup. His eyes trailed down Buddy's thin frame, over the patches of matted fur, until they landed on a faint, almost hidden mark around his neck. A scar. Walter leaned in, his fingers gently parting the fur. The scar was thin, but unmistakable, circling the soft skin like a cruel memory. It wasn't the mark of an accident. No, this had been left by something tight, something that had once bound the puppy's neck before being cut away. His jaw tightened. Someone had put a collar on this dog. And then, for whatever reason, they had removed it and abandoned him in the woods. The question gnawed at him. Why? He sat back, staring at the fire as if the flames could offer answers. He had seen cruel things in his time, had known that people often treated animals as disposable. But something about this, about the crows, about the way the pup had been left to die in the cold, felt deliberate. There was a story here, one he didn't yet understand. A sharp gust of wind rattled the cabin, sending a draft through the floorboards. Walter glanced toward the window, his thoughts drifting for a moment. The town wasn't far from here, just a short drive away. He rarely went unless he had to. His world had shrunk down to these walls and the forest beyond them. But maybe tomorrow, he'd take a trip to the local feed store, see if anyone had heard of a missing litter. Not that he expected much. People abandon dogs all the time. He looked back down at Buddy, still curled tightly under the coat, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Walter sighed. Guess we'll figure this out in the morning. He reached for an old fleece blanket draped over the arm of his chair and gently placed it over the pup. He told himself he wasn't getting attached, that this was temporary. But deep down, he already knew better. That night, as the storm raged outside, Walter lay awake, listening to the quiet, steady breathing of the small life now resting beside the fire. And though he didn't understand why, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this little dog was going to change everything. The morning was crisp, the air carrying the lingering chill of the previous night's storm. The sun had finally emerged from behind the heavy winter clouds, casting a pale glow over the small town. Walter had barely slept, his mind circling the same unanswered questions about the tiny golden retriever now curled up on a tattered blanket near the fireplace. Buddy had finally eaten a little in the early morning, just a few hesitant bites of softened kibble, but the wariness in his dark eyes hadn't faded. He moved carefully, as if expecting something bad to happen at any moment. Walter sighed as he pulled on his thick wool coat, glancing at the pup. He had never been one to dote on animals, but something about Buddy tugged at him. The scar around his neck, the way the crows had surrounded him, the fact that he wouldn't eat at first. It all felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Maybe a change of scenery would help. With some effort, he coaxed Buddy into an old leather leash he had found tucked away in a drawer. The pup hesitated at first, his body tensing, but after a few moments, he followed Walter's slow steps without protest. The leash, Walter realized, must have been a familiar feeling, though whether that was a good or bad thing, he wasn't sure. The town park wasn't far, just a few blocks from the general store. It was a modest space with a winding gravel path, a small duck pond now crusted over with ice, and a few benches scattered beneath skeletal trees. Parents often brought their children here to play in the summer, but in the winter, it was quieter, occupied only by the occasional dog walker or an elderly couple feeding the birds. Walter walked at his usual steady pace, his boots crunching over frozen ground. Buddy stayed close to his side, his small paws pressing lightly into the snow, ears flicking at every distant sound. He didn't pull against the leash, but he didn't wander either. He was cautious, scanning his surroundings with an alertness that seemed far too sharp for a pup his age. As they neared an empty bench, Walter noticed a woman standing nearby, watching a young boy who sat alone on a wooden picnic table. The woman was tall and slender, with deep brown hair tied into a neat braid resting over her shoulder. She wore a thick gray coat, her hands tucked into her pockets, her gaze full of a quiet kind of worry. Grace, that was her name. Walter knew her in passing, had seen her at the store, sometimes at the post office, always with the same tired but kind expression. She was a nurse at the town's small medical clinic, a single mother raising her son alone. The boy, Elliot, was around 10, small for his age, with light blonde hair that fell in soft curls around his pale face. He sat still, his hands resting on the table, his eyes focused intently on a spot in the distance. Unlike other children, he didn't fidget, didn't kick his legs back and forth in boredom. He simply sat, lost in his own world, silent. Walter had heard the talk. Elliot was different. Some people whispered words they barely understood. Autistic, withdrawn, peculiar. But Walter didn't care much for labels. He only knew that the boy was quiet and never caused trouble. Grace glanced over and met Walter's gaze. She gave him a polite nod, the corners of her lips lifting slightly in a tired smile. Walter returned the nod and was about to keep walking when Buddy suddenly stopped. The pup's body went rigid for a moment, his ears perking forward, his nose twitching. Then, before Walter could react, he tugged at the leash, moving toward Elliot with sudden, eager steps. Walter frowned but allowed it. Buddy wasn't the kind of dog to pull. If anything, he had been reluctant to move too quickly since Walter found him. But something about Elliot caught his attention. The boy, who had been entirely still just moments before, turned his head slightly as Buddy approached. His gaze shifted downward, locking onto the small golden retriever now sitting a few feet away. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in his movements as he slowly slid off the table and onto the ground. Walter watched closely as Elliot knelt, reaching out a small, pale hand toward Buddy. The pup didn't flinch, didn't shrink away as he had before. Instead, he took a tentative step forward, his cold nose pressing lightly against Elliot's fingertips. The world seemed to pause for a moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Elliot spoke. "Friend?" Walter felt his chest tighten. Grace's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. She took a shaky step forward, as if she wasn't sure what she had just heard. Elliot had spoken. Grace knelt beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her son's shoulder. "Elliot," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Honey, did you just say something?" Elliot didn't answer. His attention was still on Buddy, his small fingers curling lightly in the pup's soft fur. He sat down fully in the snow, unconcerned by the cold, and let Buddy rest his chin on his knee. Walter exhaled, scratching the back of his neck. He wasn't a man of faith, not anymore, but this felt like something close to a miracle. Grace swallowed hard, trying to compose herself. He hasn't spoken in years," she said quietly, her voice filled with both awe and disbelief. "Not since he was 4. Walter didn't ask why. He could see the weight in her eyes, the way grief and exhaustion clung to her shoulders. There was a story there, one full of heartbreak, but it wasn't his place to pry. He only knew that whatever had silenced Elliot for so long had been broken, at least for a moment, by the presence of a small golden-furred pup. Buddy, still resting against the boy, let out a soft huff of contentment, his tiny body relaxing for the first time since Walter had found him. Walter adjusted his grip on the leash, watching as Elliot gently stroked Buddy's ears, a quiet understanding passing between them. He didn't know what it meant, didn't know why fate had led him to that forest clearing in the middle of a snowstorm. But as he stood there, seeing a boy who had been lost in silence connect with a pup who had been abandoned to die, he had a feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than himself. The days after Buddy met Elliot were unusually quiet, but a quiet that Walter could not shake. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, like the air before a storm. The boy had formed an instant connection with Buddy, something that neither Walter nor Grace could explain. It should have been a comforting thought, but instead, Walter felt a weight settle in his chest, as though something unseen was watching, waiting. He tried to brush the feeling aside, telling himself he was being foolish. But then the crows came. It started with just one, a large black-feathered bird perched on the wooden fence outside Walter's cabin, its beady eyes fixed on the house. Walter had never paid much mind to crows before. He had lived among nature for too long to be superstitious. But something about this one unsettled him. It didn't move, didn't caw, didn't shift its feet as most birds did. It just watched. And then, the next morning, there were 2. By the 3rd day, there were a dozen of them, their dark forms crowding the bare tree branches around his home, their sharp cries echoing in the cold winter air. Buddy noticed them too. He had settled into life at the cabin surprisingly well, no longer cowering in corners or flinching at every small sound. But whenever he saw the crows, his body tensed, his ears flattened, and a low, uncertain whimper would escape his throat. Walter had never seen a dog react to birds like that before, not with fear. One afternoon, as Walter chopped wood near the back of his property, he heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over frozen gravel. He turned, wiping his brow with the back of his gloved hand, and saw a car rolling slowly down the dirt road that led to his home. It was an old model, dark blue, the kind of vehicle that had seen too many miles but was still holding itself together. The driver, a man Walter didn't recognize, pulled up just short of the cabin, his gaze sweeping the property before he stepped out. Walter narrowed his eyes. The man was tall, lean but not thin, with a sharp, angular face and a neatly trimmed beard peppered with gray. He wore a heavy black coat, the collar turned up against the cold, and his dark boots left deep impressions in the snow as he moved. There was something deliberate about the way he walked, something that spoke of a man who didn't waste energy on unnecessary movements. His eyes, a pale, almost colorless shade of green, flicked over the surroundings, taking in every detail before they landed on Walter. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Walter wasn't a man who liked strangers showing up unannounced, and something about this man, Victor, set off quiet alarms in the back of his mind. "Afternoon," Walter said gruffly, setting down the axe, but keeping his stance firm. Victor gave a small nod, the kind that didn't quite qualify as polite, but wasn't outright rude either. "You live here alone?" he asked, his voice even, measured. Walter didn't answer right away. He had lived long enough to know that when a man asked a question like that, it wasn't out of casual curiosity. "I get by," he said finally, his tone giving nothing away. Victor's gaze drifted past him, toward the cabin, where Buddy was curled up near the porch steps. The moment the dog saw him, his body stiffened, his head lowering slightly as his tail tucked instinctively between his legs. Walter saw the shift in Buddy's demeanor immediately. The pup wasn't growling or barking, not the way dogs usually reacted to strangers, but there was something else in his eyes. Recognition and fear. Victor tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Nice dog," he said, though his tone lacked any warmth. Walter's fingers twitched against his gloves. "You looking for something?" Victor's lips pressed together, as if considering how much to say. "I travel through this area sometimes. Saw a dog like that a while back, but it was with someone else. Figured I'd stop by, see if he belonged to anybody." Walter didn't like the way the man spoke. There was something too controlled about it, too rehearsed. It wasn't a lie, not exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either. He glanced down at Buddy, who was still frozen in place, his entire body wound tight like a coiled spring. Walter had never seen the pup react to anyone like this before. "I found him near the woods a few days ago," Walter said finally. "No collar, no tags. If someone lost him, they weren't looking too hard." Victor exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Maybe." He shifted his weight, glancing at the crows now scattered among the trees. "You get a lot of those around here?" Walter followed his gaze. The birds had gone eerily silent, their black eyes fixed on the two men standing below. It was the first time Victor had acknowledged them, and something about that made Walter uneasy. "They come and go," Walter replied, keeping his voice neutral. Victor let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, they do that." He looked back at Buddy one last time, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small white card. "If you hear anything about where he came from, give me a call." Walter took the card, though he had no intention of using it. He glanced down at the name printed neatly on the front. Victor Hayes. No company, no title, just a name and a phone number. Victor nodded once, then turned, walking back to his car without another word. He drove off the same way he came, leaving only a trail of tire tracks in the snow. Walter stood there for a long time, turning the card over in his fingers. He had spent most of his life minding his own business, never getting involved in things that didn't concern him. But this was different. He didn't know who Victor was or what he really wanted, but he knew one thing for certain. Buddy hadn't just been left behind. Someone had put him in those woods for a reason. As Walter walked back toward the cabin, Buddy finally moved, his small body pressing against Walter's leg, as if seeking comfort. Walter placed a hand on the pup's head, feeling the slight tremble beneath his fingers. "We'll figure this out," he murmured. Above them, the crows let out a single piercing cry before taking flight. Walter sat at his worn wooden table, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows against the cabin walls. The card Victor had given him lay in front of him, the black ink of the name and number stark against the white paper. He had spent the past few days trying to push away the unease that came with the man's visit. But no matter how much he told himself to let it go, the questions remained. Buddy had reacted to Victor, not with excitement, not with curiosity, but with fear. And then there were the crows, the way they had been watching, circling, as if they knew something he didn't. Walter wasn't the kind of man to entertain superstition, but too many things weren't adding up. He exhaled heavily, glancing toward the small figure curled up by the fire. Buddy had begun to settle into life at the cabin, but the scars of whatever had happened to him before were still evident. He rarely barked, never whined for attention the way most puppies did. He stayed close to Walter, but never underfoot, always watching, waiting, as if expecting something bad to happen. He was still too thin, still hesitant with food, though he ate when Walter coaxed him. The scar around his neck was a constant reminder that someone had once kept him bound, someone who had then decided he wasn't worth keeping at all. Walter drummed his fingers against the table, then made a decision. He wasn't the kind of man who liked digging into things, but he had spent his whole life trusting his gut. And right now, his gut was telling him something wasn't right. He reached for the old rotary phone mounted on the wall, lifting the receiver with a slow deliberation. He hesitated for only a moment before dialing the number printed on the card. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Yeah." Walter recognized Victor's tone immediately, calm even, with the kind of practiced neutrality that meant he never said more than he intended to. "It's Walter," he said simply. There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet, knowing exhale. "I was wondering when you'd call." Walter leaned back in his chair, his grip tightening around the receiver. "You know something about that dog?" Another pause, just long enough for Walter to know that Victor was deciding how much to reveal. "I might." Walter's patience had worn thin years ago. "Then talk." Victor sighed, and when he spoke again, there was something in his voice that wasn't quite regret, but close. "The dog came from a place out west, a breeding operation, big, unlicensed, cash-only kind of place. They dealt in volume, not quality. The good ones went for high prices. The bad ones," his voice trailed off. "Let's just say they didn't make it." Walter's jaw clenched. He had heard stories about places like that before. Large-scale puppy mills where dogs were treated like inventory rather than living creatures. He didn't ask what happened to the ones that weren't sold. He already knew the answer. "And you?" Walter asked, his tone sharp. "What's your part in all this?" Victor let out a humorless chuckle. "You think I ran the place? No, I was hired to shut it down." Walter frowned, surprised. He hadn't expected that answer. "Some people in this world don't care what happens to animals, but some do," Victor continued. "The kind of people who have money and don't like seeing operations like that exist. They hired me to clean things up. Find out who was running it, where the money was going, put an end to it." Walter wasn't sure if he believed him yet, but he let Victor continue. "The place was worse than most," Victor said. "They weren't just breeding for profit. They were getting rid of anything they didn't think was worth the trouble. Dogs that were too small, too weak, not the right color, not the right temperament. They had a method, and it was," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "efficient." Walter's stomach tightened. He had seen enough of life to know what that meant. "I was there the night they cleared out," Victor said. "Some of the dogs were saved, but not all of them. That pup of yours, he wasn't supposed to be one of the ones that made it." Walter glanced at Buddy, now sleeping soundly by the fire. "Then how did he end up in my woods?" Victor exhaled, and for the first time, there was something in his voice that almost sounded like remorse. "They had a system. The ones they didn't keep, they dumped in the wild, left them to fend for themselves. Some survived. Most didn't. That's why the crows were there." Walter's grip on the phone tightened. He had suspected Buddy had been abandoned, but he hadn't realized just how deliberate it had been. "So you knew," Walter said, his voice low. "You knew. And you left him there." There was silence on the other end. Then, finally, Victor spoke. "I didn't leave him. I thought he was dead." Walter closed his eyes for a long moment, anger simmering beneath his skin. He wanted to say something, wanted to demand answers, but there was nothing left to ask. He knew the truth now. Buddy had been discarded, left for dead. And the crows? They had learned that when those men came, it meant food. They had been waiting for Buddy to die, just as they had waited for the others before him. Walter let out a slow breath, steadying himself. He wasn't a man prone to sentiment, but the idea of that little pup, barely old enough to survive, left in the freezing woods to die, stirred something deep in his chest. "Why are you telling me this now?" Walter asked finally. Victor's voice was quiet. "Because I saw the way that dog looked at me, and I saw the way you looked at him. You're the first real home he's ever had." Walter was silent for a long time. "Goodbye, Victor," he said, then hung up the phone. He sat there for a moment, staring at the receiver, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then he stood, moving toward the fireplace, where Buddy stirred at the sound of his footsteps. The pup blinked up at him, his warm brown eyes meeting Walter's with a quiet trust that made something in the old man's chest tighten. Walter knelt down, resting a hand on the pup's soft fur. "You're safe now," he murmured. Buddy let out a content sigh and pressed his head against Walter's leg. And for the first time since finding him, Walter felt something close to certainty. No one was ever going to take Buddy away again. The wind howled through the dense trees surrounding Walter's cabin, rattling the window panes and sending a thin layer of snow swirling across the porch. The night was cold, colder than it had been in weeks, and the fire inside crackled softly, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. Walter sat in his old armchair, a book resting open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in the last half hour. His thoughts were elsewhere, circling the conversation he'd had with Victor days before. The truth about Buddy's past had settled in his chest like a weight, one he couldn't shake no matter how much he tried. He glanced down at the pup, now curled up beside his chair, his soft golden fur rising and falling with steady breaths. Buddy had found peace here, but Walter knew that peace was fragile. A sudden noise outside made him tense, a crunch of snow, deliberate and slow. His grip on the book tightened, but he didn't move right away. Years of living alone had sharpened his instincts, and he knew the difference between the sound of an animal passing through and the careful steps of a man who didn't want to be heard. He reached down, resting a hand on Buddy's back. The pup stirred, lifting his head, his ears pricking forward. He had heard it too. Walter stood, moving toward the window with quiet, practiced steps. Through the frost-glazed glass, he could make out a dark figure standing just beyond the porch, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. The man wasn't moving, just watching. Even in the dim light, Walter knew exactly who it was. Victor. Walter didn't hesitate. He grabbed his old shotgun from where it rested near the door, though he didn't cock it just yet. He wasn't a man who resorted to violence unless absolutely necessary, but he wasn't stupid either. He pulled the door open just enough to step outside, the icy wind biting at his skin. Buddy stood at his feet, his small frame tense, his eyes locked onto the man before them. "What the hell do you want?" Walter's voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. Victor took a slow step forward, his gloved hands tucked into the pockets of his long black coat. His face was unreadable, his pale green eyes reflecting the dim light from the cabin. "Nice night," he said, as if this were nothing more than a friendly visit. Walter wasn't in the mood for games. "You're trespassing." Victor let out a quiet breath, tilting his head slightly. "I came to settle something." His gaze dropped to Buddy, and though his face remained composed, something flickered in his expression. Something cold. "That dog, he shouldn't be here." Walter felt Buddy press against his leg, but the pup didn't back away. Instead, he let out a low, warning growl. It was the first time Walter had heard him make a sound like that. "I didn't ask for your opinion," Walter said, his grip on the shotgun tightening. "He stays with me." Victor took another step forward, his voice lowering. "That's a mistake." Walter didn't move, didn't so much as blink. "You're the only mistake standing in front of me right now." For the first time, Victor's neutral expression cracked, just slightly. His lips pressed together, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said. "This isn't just some stray dog you picked up. If people start asking questions, if someone looks too closely, it could bring the wrong kind of attention." Walter didn't need an explanation to know what Victor meant. If the truth about Buddy's past got out, it wouldn't just expose the cruelty of that operation, it would expose the people who had allowed it to happen. And Victor, no matter how much he had claimed to be on the side of shutting it down, was somehow tangled in it deeper than he let on. "I don't care about your problems," Walter said. "Buddy isn't your concern anymore." Victor's expression darkened, his voice turning to ice. "I can't let you keep him." Walter saw the shift in his posture before the words had even left his mouth. The way his shoulders squared, the slight flex of his fingers. It was the stance of a man ready to take what he wanted, one way or another. Walter didn't have time to react before Buddy did. The small pup lunged forward with a sudden burst of energy, his body launching between Walter and Victor. A fierce, guttural bark tore from his throat, nothing like the hesitant sounds he had made before. His tiny frame was rigid, his teeth bared, his eyes burning with something Walter had never seen in him before. Defiance. Victor froze, caught off guard by the sudden aggression. "Call him off," he said, his voice sharp. Walter didn't move. "I don't think he wants me to." Buddy's bark rang through the night, loud and unrelenting, his small body refusing to back down. His tail was low, his stance protective, but there was no fear in him now. He knew this man. He remembered him. And he wasn't afraid anymore. The front door swung open behind them. Grace stepped out onto the porch, her breath visible in the cold air, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "The sheriff's on his way," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "You should leave." Victor's jaw clenched. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he took a step back. His eyes flicked between Buddy and Walter, his expression unreadable once more. "This isn't over," he muttered. Walter didn't respond. He just watched as Victor turned, walking back toward the trees where his car was hidden beyond the road. The moment he disappeared into the shadows, Buddy let out a small, satisfied huff before stepping back toward Walter. Walter knelt, running a hand over the pup's head. "You did good, kid," he murmured. Buddy wagged his tail slightly, pressing against him. The distant sound of sirens cut through the cold night air. Grace stepped closer, still holding her phone, her gaze shifting from Walter to Buddy and back again. "What the hell was that about?" Walter exhaled, glancing toward the dark tree line where Victor had vanished. "That was a man who made a mistake," he said, "and he just realized it." The sheriff would arrive soon, and Walter would tell them what they needed to know. But for now, he looked down at Buddy, who was still sitting protectively at his feet, and felt something settle in his chest. This little pup, the one who had once cowered in the snow, had just stood his ground against the man who had left him to die. Walter reached down, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "Looks like you're home for good." Buddy let out a content sigh, his tail thumping lightly against the porch. And for the first time in a long time, Walter felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope. The first signs of spring came quietly, creeping in beneath the blanket of winter that had held the town in its grasp for so long. The thick snow that had once covered the ground was thinning, patches of damp earth peeking through, and the trees that had stood lifeless for months now held the first hints of budding leaves. The wind no longer howled like a ghost through the forest, but instead carried the distant chirping of birds returning home. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Walter felt it all the same. He stood on the porch of his cabin, hands in the pockets of his old coat, watching Buddy bound through the softened snow in the yard. The pup was different now. No longer the frail, frightened creature Walter had found in the woods. His once dull fur now gleamed in the sunlight, a golden coat that shone with health. His ribs, which had been too visible when Walter first brought him home, were now hidden beneath a healthy layer of muscle, his frame filling out as he grew into himself. But more than the physical change, it was his spirit that was different. Buddy was no longer hesitant, no longer cowering in the corners of the cabin as if expecting to be hurt. He ran, he played, he barked at the birds in the trees, tail wagging with confidence that had once been missing. Walter hadn't expected to get attached. He had told himself from the beginning that Buddy was just another stray, just another lost thing that had stumbled into his path. But as he watched the pup roll in the wet grass, paws flailing as he wrestled with a discarded glove he had stolen from Walter's workbench, the old man couldn't help but smile. Behind him, the sound of a car pulling up broke the silence. He turned just as Grace stepped out, her long brown hair pulled into a loose braid over her shoulder, her face flushed from the cool morning air. She was dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, her posture relaxed, in a way it hadn't been when they first met. The weight that once seemed to cling to her had begun to lift, and Walter knew why. From the passenger seat, Elliot climbed out, his small hands clutching the straps of his backpack as he glanced around. His light blonde hair had grown longer, curling at the ends, and his blue eyes, once distant and unfocused, now held something new: awareness. He spotted Buddy immediately, and without hesitation, he moved toward the pup, dropping to his knees as Buddy came bounding toward him. "Buddy!" Elliot's voice was soft but filled with warmth as he let the dog tackle him, licking his face with joyful enthusiasm. The boy giggled, the sound light and unrestrained, and Walter watched as Grace's expression softened at the sight. Elliot had changed too. The boy who once lived in silence now spoke, not often, but enough. Enough to let the world know he was there, that he was present. He still had days where he retreated into himself, where the weight of the world became too much. But Buddy had become his anchor, his tether to reality. The pup never left his side when he visited, curling up beside him on the floor, following him as he explored Walter's workshop, pressing his nose against Elliot's hand whenever the boy seemed lost in his thoughts. Grace stepped up onto the porch, pulling her coat tighter around herself, as she gave Walter a small smile. "He wouldn't stop talking about coming here all morning," she said, nodding toward her son, who was now laughing as Buddy chased a stray leaf across the yard. "I think he likes it here," Walter huffed, crossing his arms. "Well, the dog's got a habit of stealing my gloves, so I suppose he's comfortable too," Grace chuckled, leaning against the railing. For a moment, they simply stood there, watching as Elliot and Buddy played. Then, after a beat, she said quietly, "Thank you, Walter." Walter glanced at her, raising a brow. "For what?" Grace exhaled, looking out over the trees. "For everything. For taking Buddy in. For letting Elliot be part of this. He's different now. In a good way. I was so scared for so long that he'd never come back to me, that he'd always be locked inside himself. But Buddy," she trailed off, shaking her head, "he's done something I never could." Walter didn't say anything at first. He had never been good with emotional conversations, never been the type to dwell on feelings, but he understood what she meant. He had spent years alone, closing himself off, believing that the world had nothing left for him. And then, one winter morning, he had found a half-frozen puppy in the woods, and everything had changed. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "Well, guess we both needed something to shake us loose." Grace smiled at that. Elliot came running up to them then, his breath coming out in quick puffs of steam. "Buddy wants to go to the pond," he said, his voice quiet but sure. Walter raised a brow. "Oh, he told you that, did he?" Elliot nodded seriously, looking down at Buddy, who wagged his tail expectantly. Walter sighed, shaking his head. "Well, I suppose we can't ignore a request like that." Together they walked down the familiar path toward the pond, Buddy trotting happily beside them. The trees whispered overhead, the remnants of winter fading, as new life began to stir. Walter didn't know what the future held. Didn't know if Victor would return, or if there were still ghosts of Buddy's past lingering in the shadows. But for now, none of that mattered. For now, Buddy was safe. For now, he was home. Buddy's story is a testament to resilience, love, and the power of second chances. He was abandoned, just ain't left for dead, and surrounded by darkness, yet, through kindness and patience, he found a home where he was cherished. Just like Buddy, so many lost souls, both animals and people, are searching for a place where they belong. Sometimes, all it takes is one act of compassion to change a life forever. Walter, who had shut himself away from the world, discovered that love has a way of finding us even when we least expect it. Elliot, a boy who struggled to connect, found an unwavering companion in Buddy, someone who saw him for who he truly was. And Buddy, once discarded as worthless, proved that no life is ever beyond hope. May this story remind us to open our hearts, to extend kindness where it is needed, and to cherish the bonds that bring us together. Because in the end, love and compassion will always be stronger than fear and abandonment. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it touched your heart, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and hope. May God bless you and guide you always.